Order!
O God, may your spirit and guidance be in us as we work for the benefit of all our people, for peace and justice in our land, and for the constant recognition of the dignity and aspirations of those whom we serve. Amen.
Good afternoon, members. Minister's statement. Minister of Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, the Government of Northwest Territories Marine Transportation Services delivers essential goods by tug and barge to all marine accessible communities in the Northwest Territories. Residents rely on services to receive each such items as fuel, food, household goods, and while commercial customers are also required fuel, mobile equipment, and building supplies to support their businesses and provide economic growth for the territory. Mr. Speaker, Marine Transportation Services launched its second sailing season on June 20th of this year from the Port of Hay River. For the 2018 sailing season, the delivery of all scheduled cargo to 7 communities was achieved. In addition, over $20 million in commercial marine services contracts were secured. By the end of the season, a total of 41 million litres of fuel, 13,000 tons of dry cargo have been transported by tug and barge. Marine Transportation Services also supports employment and training opportunities in the marine sector for the Northwest Territories residents. At the peak of the 2018 delivery season, Marine Transportation Services workforce included 153 employees. Of these, 72 were from the Northwest Territories. The Government of Northwest Territories also partnered with N.W.T Fisheries and Marine Training Consortium earlier this year by entering into a lease with the consortium to establish a marine training center in Hay River. The training center, which operates out of the office complex at Terminal C at the Hay River Shipyard, has already supported 29 individuals through the completion of 130 training courses. New training courses planned for the fall of 2018 include a bridge watch rating program, small vessel operator proficiency, and fishing master program with 49 students registered to date. As members of the House are aware, Marine Transportation Services experienced significant challenges this year. The start of the sailing season was delayed as a result of high water levels on the Mackenzie River in late June, which caused driftwood from the Liard River to take Canadian Coast Guard navigation buoys out of position. Marine Transportation Service vessel had to wait until the buoys were replaced before they could depart. Vessel departures were further delayed by significant volume of fuel of the appropriate specification was not delivered in time to the terminal in Hay River. As a result of these issues, sailing departures and schedules were necessarily adjusted and deliveries to communities and customers were later than planned. The Marine Transportation Service Division and the Fuel Service Division worked with the fuel supplier to resolve these issues, and updating sailing schedules were posted to the Department of Infrastructure's website for the information of our customers. Vessels were also met with difficult ice conditions in the Beaufort Sea. Although the Canadian Coast Guard provided icebreaker escort assistance to our vessels, conditions worsened to a point that navigation became unsafe and the ice became impassable. For the safety of the crews, we had to make a difficult decision to cancel barge services to the communities of Paulatuck, Kalugtuck, and Cambridge Bay. Mr. Speaker, the Government of the Northwest Territories recognizes that customers of the Marine Transportation Services rely on us to find ways to deliver supplies they need, and we have committed to covering costs to airlift essential goods to these communities. The airlift will provide a quantity of petroleum products sufficient to maintain inventories until next summer's marine supply. Airlift of fuels will amount to no less than 700,000 litres. A significant portion of the deck cargo for all 3 communities will also be airlifted and prioritized on a commodity by commodity and customer by customer basis. Mr. Speaker, appropriate budgets have been set aside under the Petroleum Products Revolving Fund for the airlift of petroleum products, and the Marine Transportation Services revolving fund for the airlift of cargoes. Actual costs will depend on the aircraft that are chartered. As a result of this year's challenges, Marine Transportation Services will be taking additional steps to help mitigate similar situations should they arise in the future. We will attempt to move schedules forward for community resupply and depart from the Arctic communities as soon as conditions are ice-free. Communications will also be improved by developing a closer working relationship between headquarters and operational staff. Additional customer service representatives have been hired for Marine Transportation Services, and the processes are being established to improve response times for website updates and community outreach. Marine Transportation Services is in contact with Canadian Coast Guard throughout the navigational season, and we regularly exchange information concerning weather and ice conditions. We will endeavour to strengthen our partnership with the Coast Guard to steadily continue to monitor conditions going forward. A working group has already been established with the Coast Guard, providing additional opportunities to cooperate with the federal government on marine issues such as improved navigation. Mr. Speaker, the Government of Northwest Territories has made a mandate commitment to strengthen connections with public sector partners in transportation infrastructure. This includes working with the federal government to maintain federal commodity resupply port facilities and marine services in the Northwest Territories, to restore safe marine operating conditions in the Port of Hay River and the key sections of the Mackenzie River corridor, and to improve charting and navigational aids. This month in Hay River, the Government of Northwest Territories and the Government of Canada announced an investment of $19.5 million under the Ocean Protection Plan to procure 4 double-hull barges. The addition of these 4 barges to the Marine Transportation Service fleet will optimize delivery to communities by providing increased reliability and efficiency while providing enhanced protection to help mitigate risk to the environment. As well, the Government of Canada announced a significant investment in the harbour infrastructure in Hay River. This investment includes the construction of new floating docks and the extension of the concrete marginal wharf. These announcements advance our mandate commitments and mark an important milestone in the future marine operations in the North. This funding will help to stabilize the cost of living, provides increased protection of the marine environment, and support the efficiency of resupply to the Northwest Territories Marine Service northern communities. Mr. Speaker, the Government of the Northwest Territories remains committed to the safe and effective delivery of marine resupply services to communities. We will take this year's challenges as an opportunity to learn and improve our operations in order to prepare for a successful season next year. We will also continue to investigate additional opportunities to partner with the federal government to invest in the marine sector, to capture economic opportunities, improve marine landings, enhance charting, and improve navigation along our marine corridors. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister statements. Minister Ike Godin, the Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of the key priority areas of our government's mandate was to address the needs of individuals affected by mental health and addictions. That is why we released Mind and Spirit, promoting mental health and addictions recovery in the Northwest Territories. This is our strategic framework that helps guide our work in this area. I'd like to provide an update on some important initiatives that we are taking to enhance and improve services in mental health and addictions area. One important achievement for our government when it comes to addressing the complex relationship between homelessness, mental health, and addictions is the successful opening of our new day shelter and sobering centre here in Yellowknife. This combined centre will reduce pressure on our first responders and emergency department. It will include links and services to meet the basic needs like obtaining identification, access to housing, but also the longer-term needs like employment, social supports, and long-term treatment. The new centre has more staff and more services and will allow clients and providers to collaboratively take the next step in improving health, wellness, and outcomes. Additionally, this location will now offer flexible space that provides opportunities to leverage partnerships with organizations like the City of Yellowknife Street Outreach Program and the Arctic Indigenous Wellness Foundation. These partnerships will enable the delivery of programming that is relevant to the people accessing the day shelter and the sobering centre in a familiar and trusting environment. This represents a positive step towards the delivery of person-centered, recovery-oriented services. Mr. Speaker, another important achievement this year is the implementation of the new Mental Health Act, which came into force on September 1st. The Mental Health Act is one piece of the overall service continuum for mental health, but it is an extremely important tool in how we care for some of the most vulnerable residents. The new Act brings with it a number of improvements to the way we provide care to individuals with mental disorders. The first is patient rights. This Act contains a very strong focus on patient rights. The Act and regulations outline specific ways that patients need to be made aware of their rights. At each step in the involuntary admission process, health professionals must notify and remind patients of their rights, and they will do this verbally and by providing patient written information. In addition, posters listing the rights of people detained under the new Act will be posted in all health facilities. The second is the establishment of the Mental Health Act Review Board. The Review Board exists to provide better protection for individual rights. Any person being held under the Mental Health Act who wishes to appeal a decision made by their health professional has the right to apply to the Review Board. Lastly, the new Act has provisions for assisted community treatment. Assisted community treatment is a new option for involuntary patients. In cases where the physician has assessed it to be safe and where the patient agrees, involuntary patients can be supported to live outside of the hospital, in the community, according to a comprehensive, individualized treatment plan. While this will not be fit for all involuntary patients, it does represent an important option that will provide a less restrictive model of care and enhance safeguards. Mr. Speaker, while these initiatives I have spoken about represent significant and important work towards an improved approach to the delivery of mental health and addiction services, we know that there is still a lot of work to be done. As such, we are developing a Mental Health and Addictions Recovery Action Plan. While the Mental Health and Addictions Action Recovery Plan is in the final stages of development, it will focus on activities that enhance community and land-based approaches to care, increase integration and collaboration, and improve access to mental health and addiction services. The action plan will also feature aftercare services and support based on best practice approaches and direction from members and from N.W.T residents. There will be an enhanced focus on aftercare services and supports in the community counseling program and in community-based approaches, with the recognition that recovery looks different for everyone. We will also continue to partner with non-government organizations like the Tree of Peace, who also offer individualized aftercare supports. The action plan will be released in the 2018-2019 fiscal year and will guide the delivery of mental health and addictions recovery services for the next 2 years. Mr. Speaker, in an effort to improve mental wellness services and supports for children and youth, the Department of Health and Social Services and Education, Culture and Employment have created 42 new child and youth counselor positions and 7 clinical supervisor positions territory-wide, which will be rolled out over a 4-year period beginning in 2018. Child and youth care counselors will spend the majority of their time in schools in order to be accessible to children and youth, but also provide support to teachers and other school staff. They will reach out and offer assistance to parents and families to better equip them to provide supports to children and youth. Our counselors will also have the presence in communities to ensure that youth have options when it comes to accessing services. Counselors will work year-round, meaning that they will be available during the summer and school holidays like spring break. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to advise that the implementation of the Decho and the Tlicho is well underway. Child and youth care counselors are currently in place in Fort Simpson, Betchco, and N.W.T. The counselor of Fort Providence started on October 15th. The position in Liard and the clinical supervisor position based in Fort Simpson are currently vacant, as is a 3rd position in Betchco. The Northwest Territories Health and Social Services Authority and the Tlicho Community Services Agency are actively recruiting, working together for these positions, and they are anticipated to be filled later this fall. Until these positions are filled, services to the schools are being provided by existing community counseling program staff and child and youth care counselors already in place. The Department of Health and Social Services and Education, Culture and Employment are also preparing for the planned rollout of counselors in the Beaufort Delta and the Sawtooth regions. These regions will begin to receive funding in 2019-2020 school year. Mr. Speaker, we are committed to making sure that N.W.T residents and communities have access to a variety of programs and services that will support recovery from mental health and addictions issues. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister statement. Minister Ike Godin, the Minister Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Mr. Speaker, with over 90% of the N.W.T's businesses defined as small business, this sector is essential to the economic health of our communities and a primary driver of economic diversification across our territory. Support from our government is more important than ever before. This is Small Business Week in Canada. It offers us an opportunity to celebrate the success of small businesses in the Northwest Territories and our support for the people whose lives' work is the backbone of our Northwest Territories economy. The role of the Department of Industry, Tourism and Investment is to foster the environment in which Northwest Territories entrepreneurs and small businesses owners can invest, take risks, and prosper. Our regional offices provide single-window access for a suite of policies, programs, and funding that we deliver with partners like the Business Development Investment Corporation and Community Future organizations. ITI's regional economic development officers have access to field specialists in tourism and minerals, mentoring, business training, market assessment, and offer an extensive knowledge of support programs from outside agencies and organizations. Every year they host and support and promote entrepreneur-focused training events, from job fairs to how to start small business seminars and workshops on how to market and price home-based arts and craft products. Mr. Speaker, in 2017-18 fiscal year, $17.6 million was provided by our government to individuals, entrepreneurs, businesses, governments, and groups with economic interest across the Northwest Territories. It included, of course, contributions made under our Support for Entrepreneurs and Economic Development, or SEED policy. Our government made a commitment in our mandate to update our SEED program to better align with the needs of the Northwest Territories entrepreneurs and businesses, especially in our smaller communities. Last year, we increased the amount of funding available under SEED to better help northern businesses develop new products, build capacity, promote their services, or purchase needed equipment. We also piloted a new strategic investment stream to allow for one-time contributions of up to $75,000 for business proposals that directly increase the business and economic activities of a community. We know that for small businesses, accessing capital from mainstream commercial lenders can be challenging. Last year, the Department of ITI facilitated a workshop on this issue with Canor, the Northwest Territories Business Development Investment Corporation, the Business Development Bank of Canada, the Métis-Denny Development Fund, and several of our Community Future Development Corporations. The Department continues to evaluate and act on what we've learned from this opportunity, assessing that we are doing the right thing, what we can strengthen, and where there are overlaps or gaps. Meanwhile, we remain committed to working with the chambers across the Northwest Territories. One of many examples include how the Northwest Territories and Yellowknife Chambers plan the Opportunities North 2019 conference to be held in Yellowknife next year. The chambers serve as advocates for entrepreneurs and businesses, and as such provide us valuable feedback on how we best grow the businesses in the North. Finally, Mr. Speaker, our government is committed to the principle that the Northwest Territories businesses deserve a leg up over southern competition when they do public business. We remain committed to the business incentive policy and have defended it through the successive national and international trade negotiations. We are also working to ensure that through our Northwest Territories manufactured products policy, the manufactured goods that our government needs are sourced from N.W.T businesses can get the job done. As the government of Northwest Territories moves forward with investments in manufacturing strategy, which is under development, the agricultural strategy, the film strategy, the commercial fishing strategy, the Tourism 2020, we are working to ensure that small businesses that drive these sectors are set up to succeed. While I will be pleased to be part of the events and awards that will mark Small Business Week, I assure members of this Legislative Assembly that this sector is at the forefront of our approach to economic growth and diversification all year long and will continue to be well into the future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister statement. Amike, good day, Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to advise members that the Premier will be absent from the House today to attend the Arctic Circle Assembly in Reykjavik, Iceland. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister statements. Minister statements. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for N.W.T, that Minister Statement 103-18(3), delivered by the Honourable Minister of Infrastructure regarding marine transportation services, be moved into Committee of the Whole for further consideration. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Motions in order, motions non-debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Minister Statement 103-18(3) is now moved to a committee for further consideration. Massey. Member statement. Member for Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to acknowledge and congratulate Elder Mary Effie Snowshoe from Fort McPherson. Mary Effie was recently in Ottawa to accept the Inspire Award for Culture, Heritage, and Spirituality. At 82 years old, she grew up being taught the Gwich'in traditional way of life from her parents: hunting, fishing, trapping, preparing food, and tanning moose hides. Mary Effie continues to pass on her knowledge to family as well as visitors to the community and visitors to her fish camp. Up until 2003, Juju Mary Effie taught the Gwich'in language for 24 years until she retired. Retirement is not in her vocabulary, Mr. Speaker, as she continues to help with the traditional activities in the community and school, as well as playing host to numerous traditional teachings at her fish camp. Mary Effie has a wealth of stories to share, each with spiritual meaning. She is eager to take you by the hand to teach you on the land survival skills. We are fortunate to have elders such as Mary Effie in our community. We have so much to learn, and we should take advantage of such wise women. Congratulations to Juju Mary Effie Snowshoe. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ika Goodana, the member Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to celebrate Small Business Week and to shine a light on small business in the tourism sector in particular. There is more we can do to build on and enhance their success and to enrich the experience and opportunities of visitors to the Northwest Territories. Mr. Speaker, I went to Iceland at the beginning of June for 10 days. 7 of those days were spent on a carefully curated knitting tour of Western Iceland. The remainder was spent in and around the capital city of Reykjavik. The scenery was breathtaking, the people were hospitable, and the possibilities for activities and purchases were endless. I can't wait to go back. Mr. Speaker, the N.W.T has a lot to offer on both the scenery and hospitality fronts, but we must find new ways to support small businesses that offer tourists more to do while they're here. The simple math is that the longer visitors stay, the more they spend. The labor-intensive multiplier effects of this spending are enormous. Yellowknife is a popular destination with tens of thousands of tourists spending millions of dollars here annually. The limiting factor to the phenomenal growth we've seen is the lack of things to do. It is at best a 3-night destination for most travelers. Some active tourists may even say that length of time is too long. Aurora viewing and dog sledding are well established in Yellowknife, along with day trips and various cultural activities, but additional indoor activities in and around Yellowknife are limited, especially at this time of year when it's not summer and it's not winter either. Since tourism businesses are usually small businesses, they need a hand with research and development of additional activities for visitors. The Department of Industry, Tourism and Investment has a program to meet this need, but it could be working more effectively. The Minister has said that submissions exceed available funds by a significant amount. The program's website says that it is not taking applications at this time. Clearly, this is a program that needs a bigger budget, and let me reiterate the need for a top-class tourism information centre. The lack of a centre is ridiculous. Mr. Speaker, Iceland has grown its tourism economy almost tenfold in 10 years, and that's in spite of the fact that it's an expensive place to visit. The Icelandic government has made an investment in this sector a priority. And Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement. Thank you.
Member Nitligatia Sadzasua, Denhe Kadion, Amik, Animule. Otik, Angiwon, Member YELLOWKNIFE Center, Nadant Sadzanogion.
Merci, Mr. Speaker, merci, colleagues. The Icelandic government has made investment in this sector a priority, and the metrics of money earned and people employed are impressive. It's time for our government to increase its investment in product diversification so visitors will, and as I said, stay longer and spend more. I will have questions for the Minister of ITI. Merci.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Goodan and the member YELLOWKNIFE North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, first of all, I'm happy to see the haze in the House has cleared from yesterday. Okay, bad joke number 5. Mr. Speaker, the Yellowknife Chamber Small Business Week conference was held earlier this week, and tomorrow night the business community will be honored at the Chamber's Business Awards Gala. These events reflect on the importance of entrepreneurs and creators. These are people in our communities who take the leap of faith that their idea, new concept, or original breakthrough will pay off and create something of value. And no business idea ever succeeds without the basic component of hard work. In the 18th Assembly, we've adopted a mandate goal of growing and diversifying the economy, and small business should be a huge part of that goal. My own riding is home to many small businesses that create a busy, thriving atmosphere. From artisans to airlines to restaurants to tour operators, Yellowknife North is a busy hub of activity throughout the year. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank and congratulate the Yellowknife Chamber of Commerce, which works hard in support of the business community. This week's conference is only one of many activities the Chamber promotes. It sponsors the annual trade show, which brings together businesses from the whole territory to promote products and services from northern entrepreneurs. It sponsors networking and sharing opportunities to facilitate the growth of ideas and build connections. It supports apprenticeships and learning opportunities to facilitate learning and growth for young people entering the workforce. As a government with a mandate to support economic growth and diversification, we must make sure our funding programs and policies ease the way for businesses to grow and prosper. We must ensure that our regulations don't overcomplicate and delay the processes for licensing, permitting, and building at a time that's crucial for the growth of a startup. We must commit and recommit to supporting this vital economic sector. Finally, Mr. Speaker, this year's Business Awards received a record 143 nominations. I'd like to congratulate all the award nominees for their dedication and hard work, and I'd like to thank the Chamber once again for their ongoing support of the business community in Yellowknife and the entire N.W.T. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Goodan and the member Tuna de Wolade.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I would like to talk about small businesses in the communities that I represent. First, I would like to share some employment statistics about the 4 communities in the riding. According to Stats Canada, in 2016, the average employment rate in Canada was 60.2%, whereas in the N.W.T. it sat at 66.2%. Comparatively, Fort Resolution's employment rate is 49.3%, Tlutsalke 45.7%, Deda was 44.4%, and Dilo was 26.5%. Imagine, Mr. Speaker, almost 3/4 of your working age people do not have jobs. Mr. Speaker, this dismal employment rate in these small communities, with this dismal employment rate, any type of work, whether it comes from small business otherwise, is welcomed. Over the years, I have been in the House and I have pushed for employment opportunities to be developed within the riding of Tuneda-Willowday. While some of these opportunities have been realized over the years, many have not. So today, I would like to reiterate some small business ideas that I believe will be beneficial to the communities I represent. Recently, Mr. Speaker, I discussed the dire need for a daycare in Tlutsalke. Many people feel that there are various long-term benefits to children who attend daycare daycare prior to attending school. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, the entire riding of Tuneda-Willowday is in need of small businesses targeted at cleaning up the hundreds of waste and contaminated sites across the riding. To help facilitate the growth of such businesses, there will be a need to train heavy equipment operators and people that are skilled in determining when a waste site has been fully remediated. Mr. Speaker, tourism is an industry that is booming in the city of Yellowknife. While it has a positive impact on Deda and Dilo, however, some of these tourism opportunities should be afforded to Fort Resolution and Clutsalke. Mr. Speaker, I believe that all the communities in Tuneda-Willowday will gain meaningful work from the commercial fishing industry. Arts and craft and performing arts can also see an emergence in small communities as we have many talented artists in our riding. Lastly but not least, Mr. Speaker, there are businesses that wish to get into the cultivation and distribution of legal cannabis. Yesterday was a good indication that small businesses need some sort of distribution center. Additionally, I believe the soil conditions in many communities are ideal for growing cannabis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement, Member Ike Goodden and the Member Satu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I recognize Small Business Week and the many challenges facing this community for continued stability and sound going concern, while recognizing the many contributions created by our N.W.T. small business community, right from household income to property taxes. Mr. Speaker, aside from governments and industry in my region, we have the small business. Isolation by itself, Mr. Speaker, is of huge concern. Mr. Speaker, isolation creates barriers of limitations to supply, recruiting skilled labor, and the marketplace, pardon me. Mr. Speaker, our government, through strategic engagements, providing land access certainty, and I look forward to the capital conclusion of our physical framework. These, Mr. Speaker, would contribute to supporting our small business community. Mr. Speaker, this Tuesday, I will support small business by attending the Oscar and Bear River Bridge public engagement consultation meetings. Opportunities by construction. Later, Mr. Speaker, I will have questions to the Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment. Merci.
Yeah. Merci. Member statement, Member Ike Goodden and the Member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's Small Business Week. Whether you need auto work done, a veterinarian for your little companion, landscapers, metalworking, a building built, area cleared, or road built, Cam Lake is the economic engine of the capital city. With that in mind, our priority in this House must be to foster continued economic growth, remain competition, and create well-paying jobs for the middle class, and everyone working hard to join it. The N.W.T. must remain committed to helping Northern creators, innovators, and entrepreneurs target, explore, and take advantage of global opportunities in key business markets, just like the fine entrepreneurs of Cam Lake have done. I want to give a shout out to a few of these businesses that are not an exhaustive list. Energy Wall, Arctic Farmer, Polar Tech, Paul Brothers Nextstream, Boreal Garden, Ron's Auto, Fiberglass North, CR Enterprises are all fine examples of hardworking northern entrepreneurs that show they've got what it takes to remain resilient and economically viable and profitable in an often difficult economic market. And that leads me to my next point, Mr. Speaker, is how the N.W.T. supports its business community through funding. The Minister earlier today spoke about the SEED program and the contributions from BDIC. BDIC has a budget of up to $200,000 for the 18-19 fiscal year, and the SEED program is budgeted at $3.866 million. These are great programs, and they're very popular, but they're often oversubscribed. In fact, in the North Slave region, ITI's SEED money has run out. BDIC's startup money for entrepreneur ran out within 2 months of this fiscal year. These are very concerning for entrepreneurs who want to get into the market. And it's great that we celebrate them in this House on Small Business Week and throughout the year, but we need to do more than simply talk. We need to put up the capital that they need to get going. I'm glad the minister is working on this, but we need more than just a workshop. We need to put money into these budgets to further advance the conditions of economic growth that have been so successful in the past. So I'll have questions for the minister, and I hope he has good answers that are more than about studying the problem and actually investing much-needed capital into our private sector. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Member statement. Member Ike Godani, member N.W.T.
Kinani, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on Saturday, October 20th is a special day for the community of N.W.T. I'm grateful to witness the 100th birthday celebration for Ms. Persis Grubin, along with her family, friends, relatives, and many people from other communities around the Northwest Territories. This day is a milestone for Persis as her family and the community of N.W.T. She is the first person that anyone knows who has reached the milestone age of 100 years old in N.W.T. Mr. Speaker, Persis has seen throughout her century on earth a challenging yet rewarding lifetime for her and her late husband, Charlie Grubin. Together they had 12 children that they raised and passed on their traditional knowledge and culture as Inuvialuit into their children. To date, Persis has a thriving, huge family from an estimated number of 60 to 70 grandchildren, 110 great-grandchildren, and over 65 great-great-grandchildren. Mr. Speaker, Persis was born to Sarah Kay and her biological father, Lyman Cooey, on October 20th, 1918 at the Peel River. Lyman had tragically and unfortunately passed on in an accident before Persis was born. Mr. Speaker, Persis is fluent in Gwich'in and Inuvialuit and speaks both languages better than anyone they know. Her mother, Sarah, remarried an Inuvialuit man, Lenny Nglangasek, who she called Dad and loved him dearly, and he accepted and loved Persis as his very own. Mr. Speaker, Lenny taught Persis the Inuvialuit way of life and the language that she speaks today, and orally shares her teaching of the Gwich'in and Inuvialuit cultures and traditions to all generations after 1918. Mr. Speaker, she's the eldest of 5 children that Sarah and Lenny had. Today, she still lives in N.W.T. at her very own home, where she feels the most comfort and familiarity with her surroundings. Today, I would like to commend Persis Grubin for almost 100 years on earth and sharing of her knowledge, tradition, and culture to all who cross her path. Mr. Speaker, on Saturday, October 20th, please take a moment to think about Persis as she turns 100 years old. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Member statement. Member Ike Godani, member N.W.T.
Masi, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Untitled Reserve Access Road starts at the junction of Highway 5, just by the bridge over the Hay River, running along the east side of the river into the Hay River Reserve. As our only access point to the community when the Hay River is flowing in the summer months, our people rely heavily on the road. The road is our lifeline for 7 months, and is our only access from the community into the town of Hay River and the rest of the highway system. Mr. Speaker, iti hatlo deche gutsan kuleni alas himatsan daninte kin due gora meke alai das go. He said do matsan danite kule meke getsan bea zon holy lauti gora iti kap iti kule cha tu neznia kajiki alagin dago iti N.W.T hinji tsegini ala. As early as March 12 of this year, I made a statement in this House discussing exactly this issue, to which the Minister of Infrastructure committed to continue to have a look at it going forward. Mr. Speaker, it is now October and we have not seen any improvements. In fact, the road, which was chip sealed in 2010, was completely broken up and some sections were reverted back to gravel. Conditions have drastically deteriorated. This is a serious issue to our community and an embarrassment. When we hosted guests for the annual Hand Games tournament in the Delhi National Assembly this past summer. Mr. Speaker, the access road is only a few kilometers long, a short stretch to Highway 5. I find it perplexing that our First Nations First Nation needs continue to be overlooked. I will have questions for the Minister of Infrastructure later. Masi, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Member statement. Member Ike-Godana, the member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Our government passed mere legislation and regulations for resource management that came into effect as part of the devolution process. In the Oil and Gas Operations Act, Section 52 allows for the making of regulations under this legislation. The oil and gas spills and debris liability regulations were made under this authority and set absolute liability limits of between $10 and $40 million, depending on the location of a spill or debris caused by oil and gas exploration and production. If damages exceed the absolute liability limits, then all parties may be responsible for the oil or gas spill, especially with onshore areas that we regulate now. This means that the N.W.T and our taxpayers may be on the hook if damages exceed these caps. The same caps are in place in federal legislation for the offshore and have not been changed in 30 years. That means if we can't prove fault or negligence, the public pays for whatever disasters may be created. This is the offshore, but the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico cost British Petroleum more than $90 billion in fines and settlements. Lost tourism revenues totaled more than $23 billion alone. In October 2011, the U.S. Department of Interior's Minerals Management Services was dissolved after it was determined it had exercised poor oversight for the drilling industry. 3 new agencies were placed at separating the regulation, leasing, and revenue collection responsibilities, respectively. Countries such as Norway and Greenland have no liability caps, and the Auditor General of Canada recommended in 2012 that the caps on the Canadian offshore be reviewed and changed. Clearly, the liability caps set in N.W.T regulations for oil and gas operations are not consistent with the polluter pays principle. They are outdated compared to other jurisdictions and international experience. Why on earth would Cabinet cap liability on damages that could run into the hundreds of billions of dollars? Why has the minister not changed to remove the liability caps in the more than 4 years since devolution? I will have questions for the Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment, who sets the regulations, manages leasing, and collects revenues from oil and gas development, and is also the promoter of such development. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister's statement. Member Ike-Godana, the member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's Small Business Week, a time to celebrate small businesses and their contributions to our economy, and the perfect time to start discussing how to better utilize the untapped potential that this government has to help support our small businesses. We all know that we must diversify our economy, and small businesses are absolutely essential to doing so. However, Mr. Speaker, it seems like when it comes to big mining companies, this government is willing to bend over backwards. But it often seems like they're barely willing to lift a finger to help small businesses. An advocacy group for small businesses, the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses, agrees, and the annual report card it produces has given the N.W.T more failing grades than any other jurisdiction in Canada. Now, don't get me wrong, Mr. Speaker, I don't want to diminish the good work that the staff of ITI do with what little they're given. My concern is that one of the smallest departments in the N.W.T seems to be the only one working to help small businesses. The N.W.T's motto is one government, one voice. Well, maybe I've been working too hard or not getting enough sleep, Mr. Speaker, because I've been hearing multiple voices. Instead of a cohesive cross-departmental approach to small business development, we have departments operating in silos, with most of them claiming that business development isn't in their mandate, or in other words, it's not my job. Well, Mr. Speaker, the Department of Finance handles payments and policies. The Department of Infrastructure and the Housing Corporation handle procurement. ECE deals with labor development and training. And ITI has business support and diversification units. It sounds to me like small business development is everyone's job. We've been told that this government has just proposed its biggest ever capital budget. What better way to support small businesses than by spending hundreds of millions of dollars? Unfortunately, other than putting the projects out there, the government has done nothing to capitalize on this opportunity to help develop small businesses. Mr. Speaker, it's time that this government develops a comprehensive, cross-departmental approach to small business development. Entrepreneurs are out there every day busting their backs to keep people employed, and it's time that this government stops taking them for granted and gives them the support they deserve. They don't get the opportunity to say, it's not my job, and we shouldn't either. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statements. Member statements. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Colleagues, I'd like to draw your attention to the people in the gallery today with us. Mr. Ernie Bernhardt, former member of 12th Legislative Assembly for Kitikmeot region at that time. Welcome to our assembly. And I would like to welcome some visitors here as well. We have here with us Chief Electoral Officer for Yukon Territory, Mr. Max Harvey, who is accompanied by Northwest Territories Chief Electoral Officer Nicole Latour. Mr. Harvey is in Yellowknife to learn about the direction and best practices of our election management body. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Harvey and Ms. Latour to the House this afternoon. Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Yellowknife Center.
Mr. Speaker and Mr. Speaker, excuse me, it gives me great pleasure to introduce the Mayor-elect of Yellowknife and my constituent, Rebecca Alty. I'd also, like to recognize Nicole Latour, who is also my constituent, and thank her for her ongoing work running elections in our territory. Merci.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to take this opportunity to recognize and thank a couple of the pages from Hay River North, Ms. Charlotte Booth and Ms. José Tousnard, who have been here with us all week. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Range Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to start by recognizing the constituent, David Washelshu. I'd also like to recognize our new mayor, Rebecca Alty, who went through the Women's Campaign School, and I'd also like to recognize Nicole Latour, who actually helped facilitate one of our campaign schools. Campaign schools for women work. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Inuvik, Twin Lakes.
I'd like to also recognize a couple of pages in the Assembly from Inuvik. We have Amber Lenny Ipana and we have Kyra Buckle, who are both from Inuvik. I'd like to thank them for the work they do, plus all the other pages for the work they do looking after the members. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to recognize Mr. Ernie Bernhardt. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Bernhardt's been one of the founders of the Northern Games and Arctic Sports, and he's been an avid coach during Arctic Sports through all the Arctic Winter Games and the Northern Games and the Circumpolar Games around the Arctic. So, Ernie, thank you for your traditional knowledge and your and what you bring to the games year after year. And also, I'd like to recognize the Mayor-elect, Ms. Rebecca Alty, and also everyone else in the gallery. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognition of visitors in gallery. Recognition of visitors in gallery. If we miss anyone in the gallery, welcome to our chambers. It's always great to have an audience as part of our proceedings. Merci. Acknowledgments. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to acknowledge the life of Yellowknife North resident Dusty Miller, who left us last summer at age 99. Miller was the last remaining veteran of World War II living in Yellowknife. He and his wife raised 4 children in the North and served the Royal Canadian Legion for 60 years. He was a familiar face at Remembrance Day ceremonies and recipient of the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal in 2013 for community service. Members, please join me in applauding and acknowledging the life and contributions of Mr. Dusty Miller. Thank you.
Merci. Acknowledgments. Acknowledgments. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife Center.
Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment. The tourism industry, as we know, continues to grow, and spending more money on product diversification makes sense. But the budget for this program is oversubscribed and it is now currently unavailable. What is the Minister's plan to increase investment in this vital program? Merci.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, ITI has to work within the constraints of the budgetary process and the money that we're allocated. We've had a serious look at the seed program. This House knows that. We've looked at it last year. We've changed things around to try to make things better for entrepreneurs by changing certain parameters around programs and having regional supports. And we will continue to do that within the budget that we have. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Kidade Cassie, member Yellowknife Center.
Mr. Speaker, as I understand that answer, 2 points are prominent. One is that it's our fault for not asking, and the other is seed as the alternative. Are those in fact the case? Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll get used to standing up today here, but yeah, she can take some of the blame if she wants, the member, for them not asking. The budgetary process is done by all members of this House, and we know how it's allocated. And the budget that ITI has, that's what I have to prescribe to. I can make my case as we go through these deliberations with my cabinet members, but there's only so much money to go around for the whole Northwest Territories, and that's what I've been allocated, and that's what I'll continue to work with. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tadade Cassie, member Yellowknife Center.
Mr. Speaker, as the Minister knows, the Tourism 2020 plan is moving towards expiry. I'm interested to know what work is taking place now to create Tourism 2025. Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, 2020 is coming due, and we've made successful milestones. As all members of this House know, we've already achieved probably what we wanted to there as far as the number of tourism to come to the Northwest Territories and the amount of money spent in N.W.T, and we will continue to work on that. We'll probably be releasing some of those numbers shortly of last year's visitations and money spent in the N.W.T, and I think most members will be happy. We will be working closely with all proponents, be us and members of this House, for feedback, as well as N.W.T Tourism, to develop 2025. And I just came back from an FPT on tourism, so I have some new information that was presented to us from various proponents across the country of challenges around tourism right across the country that we'll try to implement in our new strategy as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nundere Cassie, member Yellowknife Center.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we've seen incredible growth in tourism during the period of the Tourism 2020 plan, and this sector of our economy needs more support than it currently gets. So my question for the Minister is, will the new plan include more money for both community investment and product development than the current plan has? Thank you.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are a victim of our own success. I've said that in this House before. Build it and they will come, and that's what happened around tourism. And that's what's happening particularly in the region of Yellowknife. The numbers are increasing every year. There's all kinds of challenges around that. But as we move forward with 2025 plan, we're going to have deliberations around budgets and stuff, and I'm going to have to make the case going forward for what tourism needs in the Northwest Territories. And I'll have to make the case in a significant way that the Finance Minister and Cabinet members will divvy up the money accordingly. And this is a priority and for the Government of the Northwest Territories, for all members in this House, then we will pursue that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, the member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's good to see we've gotten into a discussion around ITI's available funding for entrepreneurs. I want to talk about the SEED program. The Minister spoke about increasing the funding criteria for entrepreneurs, but the Minister didn't actually make more funding dollars available, which means that money is being spent the complete allocations being spent, but fewer businesses are receiving funding. In fact, the funding for agriculture, film, and manufacturing strategies have been taken out of the SEED program. They don't represent new funding. So when is the Minister going to put new funding into this program and start to grow the economy even more than we've already managed to achieve? Thank you.
Massey. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I mentioned, there's only so much money this government has, and we have our processes and deliberations on how we want to spend that money, and everyone in this House is included. And this is what I've been allocated, and I will continue to fight for more money for my department, but as the member quite knows, there's not enough money to go around for everything this government wants to achieve. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For a question, Member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, it seems that when we have an immediate need, we can find the money. We can find money for barges, $16 million conjured out of thin air. So I wonder if the Minister can answer this question. Does he think it's acceptable that available funding for entrepreneurs is running out within 2 to 3 months of the fiscal year? Thank you.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This money is to help entrepreneurship. It's not to support a business and keep them in business. This is to help support business. Let's make it quite clear. Business is an entrepreneurial-driven thing. The government of Northwest Territories is not in the business of being in business. Let's make that very clear. I'm one of the few people in this House that's a business person. My whole life I've been a business person. I understand this file probably better than anyone in this House. Yes, some of these programs are stretched to their limit. But we only have so much money. What do you want me to do? Do you want me to just print money? I can't print money. If you want us to put more money into this program, I'll need support of committee. I need support of members on this side of the House and residents of the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Members, I'd like to caution to the members that the last question was asking Minister's opinion, so be careful around that area. Oral question, Member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and we'll be cautious around the Minister's opinions. You know, the Minister is, the statements he's making around not having enough funding, I mean, he sounds more like a Deputy Minister than a Minister, but is the Minister prepared to make a submission to Cabinet or to the Financial Management Board during the next round of budget deliberations to increase the available SEED funding? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can make that submission. That's not an issue. And I've already brought up the issue around the shortfall of funding from our department. We all make our case, and I will continue to do that. And when it comes time to deliberate the next budget, and when I have a look at the data from the SEED program, I will certainly make that decision at that point. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question, Member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The data is old news. So we've all known this program's oversubscribed. So I know the Minister said he can make the submission. Will he make that submission based on the debate we're having right now and based on what he already knows, that this program is oversubscribed? Will the Minister make that submission? Yes or no? Thank you.
Massey. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said, I'll have a look at the information when this comes up in the next budget session and make that decision going forward. I'm going to have a hard look at this because, as I've said, there's a hope, and the member has to have a look at this. If we're going to put more money into the SEED program, which would be great for myself, it's got to come from somewhere within this House. Now, do you want to take it from health? Do you want to take it from social services? Where do you want to take it from? Maybe the member can give me that feedback back. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question, the member Satu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I like the Minister's earlier statement there, build it and they will come. Mr. Speaker, this is Small Business Week, and I appreciate the Minister's words about small business in his statement today. I would, however, like to ask the Minister some questions about the government support for small business in the Sahtu region. Can the Minister give me examples of how ITI is supporting the businesses in the Sahtu? Thank you.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've highlighted in my statement today, we've spent $17.6 million to the government, with the government this last year to help support individuals and businesses and governments and groups across the economic sector. In his particular riding, we've spent $1.6 million. But at the same time, we realized there was a downturn with the Line 21 being shut down and a lot of pressure on the small businesses in that member's riding. And we've worked very closely to realign those businesses and what they need to do. They got to target different products, services, and customers as such. The department has worked very closely with them. This coming week, I think it's this coming week, the Department of ITI is going out to communities outside the members' riding of Norman Wells, to all the smaller communities. And we're going to have an information session about how to start a small business in his region, and the staff is there to assist them. But in particular, our department also takes great pride in the small communities on how we support and strengthen the traditional economy. And so we want to meet with all eligible trappers and what type of assistance is available for them as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question at Kidade, Cassie member Sahtu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the Minister for the reply. That leads me to my next question. The Minister mentioned the SEED program, or the SEED policy, and the government's mandate for the 18th Assembly. It commits to updating SEED programs to better align themselves with the needs of entrepreneurial and small business owners. Can the Minister provide an update on this work? Thank you.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said earlier in my statements, that we had a look at the SEED program, and we realized that there were some pressures on it and rising costs around some of these things, and we got feedback from a number of N.W.T businesses, so we looked at changing this up. Our budget still is $3.86 million. That's what we've talked about here earlier already today, and that hasn't changed at all. But what has changed is individual applicants and has increased for most of our programs. So we've changed some of the changes that we made is the individual contribution under the entrepreneur entrepreneur support stream has increased from 15 to 25,000. Individual contributions available under the business intelligence and networking stream has increased from 3,000 to 4,000. And entrepreneurs capped out on their contribution under the micro business stream is now eligible to reapply in 3 years instead of 5 years. We're also piloting a strategic investment stream in 2017 that we have renewed for this year, which allows one-time contributions up to $75,000 for individuals to meet criteria based on the mandate of increasing economic growth and diversity. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Cassie member Sahtu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks for the Minister's reply on that. My next question is, the government's mandate also commits to implementing the economic opportunities strategy. That's not something we heard a lot about lately. Can the Minister update the House on this work?
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In fact, we're planning and providing the members an update on this later in the session, but I'm happy to share some information right now with members. The reason the member hasn't heard much about the economic opportunity strategy is because most of the recommendations that were made in that document become part of our mandate, and we've talked about the work as this mandate commitments. In fact, the strategy's 117 recommendations now have been addressed, and more than 70% have resulted in ongoing improvements and initiatives by our government. We've begun the work investment and revitalize the Great Slave fishing industry. We're implementing the Northwest Territories Immigration Strategy 2017-2022. We're advancing the Northwest Territories Agriculture Strategy with new funding and partnership. We're developing a manufacturing strategy. And thanks to the rebate program, our film sector is thriving and generating benefits for many of our sectors of our economy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. No data cast members out too.
My final question is around the role of BDIC is also to be a developmental leader and to flow funding to the Northwest Territories businesses, and that is a need of most. Like the small communities in my riding, what is the N.W.T doing to ensure that the BDIC provides the best value to the N.W.T? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
BDIC is a valuable contributor to the N.W.T economy. One of the things that's come up in this assembly is the BDIC Act has a program review written into it every 5 years, and that's what we're doing right now. We're having a serious look at that. And ITI is leading that work along with BDIC and its stakeholders, so that work will continue, and I think most members have a bit of an understanding of it because they've been briefed on it. But the terms of reference have been finalized already, and we've shared them with Standing Committee, and it has three main focuses. And they are it will consider how well BDIC has achieved its objectives over the last 5 years. It will include an environmental scan to identify future challenges and market conditions, and consider what services and programs BDIC should have in place for the future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, he could carry the members.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, every day the minister gets up, has his coffee, and looks across the river. Has the Minister of Infrastructure ever driven the access road to the Hay River Reserve? And if not, then invite him to do so that he can see for himself what my constituents have to endure on a daily basis. Merci.
Merci. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe the question is, have I ever driven the road? Of course I've driven that road. I live in Hay River. I've been over there probably every month. I see the condition of the road. This member has asked me questions about the road conditions there before. I've stated in this House the work that has commenced on there around drainage and these types of things and some geotechnical work. That work has been completed, and that will feed into what our next plans are to do with that section of highway. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Council Member Deschaux.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I myself recently made a trip to the Hay River Reserve, and I've noticed, and I think everybody noticed, that the ditches, parts of the road have been dug up, and piles have been on the side of the road for some time. So, in response to my questions from March 12th, the minister committed to sending engineers to the road this past spring to do an assessment. Has this assessment been done, and what were the outcomes? Merci.
Merci. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think instead of beating around the bush, I'm going to go right to the crux of this. The capital estimate's been tabled in the House of the Assembly, and I would be glad for the member to ask me questions, deliberation around this section of road, what he's referring to, and I think he's going to be quite happy to see what information comes out of that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Council Member Deschaux.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very optimistic, but I like to see at least some action play out maybe by this spring. I'll ask the questions that most KFN members have on their mind. When will the Department of Infrastructure repair the access road onto the reserve? Merci.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I just referenced in my previous answer, I'm glad to answer these questions when we get into the Committee of the Whole. And if the member wants to ask me specific questions on this section of highway, I think he's going to be very happy with his answers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Member Decho.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is the typical replies and answers that I've received from the Minister of Infrastructure. He's basically deflecting any kind of answers and hope that he could give to people from the Untitled Reserve. I've referenced the capital estimates. There's no specific reference to the Untitled Reserve access road. Does the Minister of Infrastructure care about the Denny and the reserve? Merci.
Yeah. Merci. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think he's asking me my opinion, and I'm not going to give him the satisfaction of answering a question like that. I've made it quite clear. When we go to the Committee of the Whole, I want this member to specifically ask me the question about his section of road, and he will be very happy with the answer that he's going to get. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral questions. Member Nanakput.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We seem to be on a roll with the current, with the last minister's responses, and my questions are for the Minister of ITI. Mr. Speaker, in the members' the minister's statement earlier mentioned that the Petroleum Products Revolving Fund will help fund the airlift to the communities of N.W.T and to Nunavut. Mr. Speaker, I believe at this time the Petroleum Products Revolving Fund is a full recovery system at this time, and these costs may be covered by the customers. Mr. Speaker, what will happen to the cost of petroleum products for Nunavut customers in 2018-19? Mr. Speaker, in other words, will the cost of gas go up in Nunavut? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think if the member is referring to the transportation costs of what it's going to take to get these 700 and some thousand litres into these communities, that cost is not going to be added on to the backs of these people in these communities. But the process will play out, whatever the POL, our formula is to increase or decrease the price of fuel on the price of delivery at the time of the delivery of the barges and the price of the purchase of the fuel. That process is still in place. But the actual cost of this extraordinary event of flying this fuel in is not going to be passed on. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, member Nanakput.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's actually good to hear. You know, I know that the first planes are arriving now, and hopefully that can keep the cost of living down in the region. Mr. Speaker, I have 5 constituents who are businessmen, and they will not receive their goods by this upcoming airlift. This means that lost business opportunities due to the fact that they aren't deemed essential goods. Mr. Speaker, what does the Department of Industry, Tourism and Investment have to offer small businesses as they are paying off heavy equipment, vehicles, dry goods for their stores, and also insurance on equipment that they will not receive until the fall of 2019? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Department has a number of mechanisms that we can support business and provide business relief. I would encourage any business that is in this situation being described by the member to contact our regional office and talk to one of our client personnel. And ITI will look at individual applications and present it on a case-by-case basis for assistance under our SEED program. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, member Nanakput.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the response, and it's good to see that there may be some assistance to some entrepreneurs and some small businesses who cannot afford to stay afloat over the 2018-19 season if they weren't allowed access to any type of assistance. Mr. Speaker, there are also multiple research programs that run annually in Nunavut, as well as exploration programs on Banks Island. Mr. Speaker, to us, research is important, you know, in traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, scientific knowledge, and we encourage that in our region so that we have better data to understanding our ecosystem. Mr. Speaker, what can the department offer to ensure that scheduled programs may still run through 2018-19 season given the shortage? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In fact, I understand this past year was a record year for research in the region, both national and international researchers. We recognize that these are important economic contributors to the members' region, but in reality, ITI has little influence on the research schedules. Most research projects are independent in nature and receive logistical support through the Aurora Institute. To date, we have not been aware of any difficulties with research projects in the region, but if they are, we will consider them on a case-by-case basis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question. Member N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A lot of these research and exploration projects usually fly in their own petroleum in the way of 45-gallon drums, and hopefully that these are deemed essential as it employs people in the region. Mr. Speaker, hotels in N.W.T. are at times the only place to house contractors, government employees, and visitors to the communities. Mr. Speaker, how will the Department of ITI ensure that operations such as these important components of community infrastructure remain in operations with a shortage? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure, Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm assuming the member is speculating about the availability of goods and supplies for those operations. Again, we are not made aware of this immediate concern. Mr. Speaker, we recognize that this is an extraordinary situation that we are dealing with. There's no manual with all the answers, but we are addressing the reality of this situation head-on. As the Minister of Infrastructure, I assure the member and this House, the people of N.W.T. we will do what we need to do. I've said that continually in this House. We can't do everything, particularly around a number of questions I always get around is hurking vehicles in, and we're not prepared to do that. We're trying to work with everybody on a commodity-by-commodity basis and a community-by-community basis, and we'll continue to work with this and try to address it the best we can. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, member Tunade.
Mr. Speaker, just listening to the question period here today, I heard the Minister of ITI respond to the member from Sawtoo about the number or the dollar amount that's being spent in Sawtoo. I'd like to ask the Minister if he has that dollar amount for the riding of Tunade also. Thank you.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do not have that information right here at my desk, but I can get that exact number for the member and provide it to him. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question. Member Tunade.
Mr. Speaker, in my member statement, I referred to some of the businesses that there were potential businesses in Tunade. I'd like to ask the minister if the minister would direct the Business Development Investment Corporation to send business development officers into the communities to meet with the community groups in order to flesh out what other possibilities may exist in the community for small business. Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I could certainly have a look at the staff that we sent into the Sawtoo region and work with the member and what we can do in his region to send our staff in there to talk about what's the possibilities of starting up small businesses and opportunities, as well as I mentioned earlier in my statements today, to work around the traditional economy and how the trappers and hunters and trappers can access some of the seed money as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Member Tunade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know that the Minister meant Tunade, but I'm looking to ask the Minister a question on the number. Earlier, the Minister had indicated that there was not enough money to help everyone. That's why I asked the initial question, but my question would be, I anticipate that there is not enough money going into business development in my writing. So I'd like to ask the minister if he, once he's able to provide the numbers, if the minister would come back to the House for additional funding to support some business development in the small communities. Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said, this government has spent $17.6 million. The SEED program is $3.8 million. We have Community Futures, which we fund as an additional $825,000. There's a number of programs and suits of needs out there that these people want. The member's kind of speculating that he's not getting enough money in his riding. I'd have to go back and see what types of applications and what type of dollars have been spent in his region. But this is all driven, as I've said in this House earlier today, this has got to be entrepreneurial driven. We just can't be throwing money at something and hopefully it sticks. We have to work with the business people in these communities that are future entrepreneurs that want to pursue these types of things, and that's what we're trying to do. The SEED policy is there to help facilitate that with a number of programs within the Department of ITI, and we will continue to do that. So that's the best I can answer the member's question. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Member Tunade Wolade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the minister if there's any sort of policy that surrounds employment numbers. In my member statement, I referred to the dismal employment numbers we have in the communities that I represent. I'd like to ask the minister if when spending money from the government for business development, if that is taken into consideration. Are employment numbers taken into consideration when spending money for any businesses in any of the communities in the territories? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, it depends on what application I suspect we're doing. If you're going through BDIC or Community Futures and you're trying to get a loan to start a company, you got to have a business case to do that. And that's relative to, you know, what your business case is going to be and the number of products you're going to be able to sell and the capital you have to invest and the capital that we're going to invest to help support these things. But when it comes to supporting number of people hired in a community, I suspect that depending on some of our grants and contribution programs that we have, some of those factors are part of the decision making. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. The member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment. Earlier today, my colleague from Hay River North spoke a lot about red tape and redundancy that we have within the government of the Northwest Territories. He referenced the Canadian Federation of Independent Business and how they consistently give us failing grades or an F, and I just want to know, does our government kind of recognize this ongoing, never-ending failing grade, or do we just flat out reject it? You know, this institute comes and gives us this every year, or better yet, what are we actually doing to identify our own challenges with regard to red tape and the roadblocks that small business face within our government? Do we foresee that we have these challenges, and are we doing anything about them? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't think I referenced the Federation of the Business thing, but I've met with them. They have their opinion on what's happening in the Northwest Territories. My recollection is they use a very small case of data to give us this grade. But we've recognized that, as I've said, I'm a small business owner in the Northwest Territories. The one thing that we did help to address this is through our BizPal program. That is a very good program online. You can go on there and it takes you all through the licensing and permitting or whatever you need to do to help especially brand new entrepreneurs know exactly what they need to do, from workers' compensation to all these sorts of things. So it's clearly laid out in there, and I believe that we're doing the best we can to help address this. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question. Member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Best we can is really kind of vague, to be quite frank. If the minister could please elaborate a little bit to share with us what best we can means, and what does that mean as it relates to the silos that seem to be kind of structured between various departments that small businesses have to interact on a daily basis. You know, the business community sees the Department of ITI as their representative at the territorial level, and so what is the government actually doing to identify the challenges of red tape, bureaucracy and redundancy, and what policies are they developing to help break that down? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is kind of like our procurement issue. I've never had anyone come and knock on my door complaining about red tape. But I'm glad to work with the chair of standing committee of SCEDI and sit down. If they have any ideas on how we can rectify red tape within the government of Northwest Territories, I'd be glad to have those discussions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Tada Cassie, member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm glad that the minister brought it up. In fact, government procurement obviously contributes significantly to the business community in the Northwest Territories. We've raised a number of times concerns around government procurement. The Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment undertook a survey this summer. We're hoping to put forward a report later to table in the House and share with the minister and his department about the challenges that we found. And so I would just like to ask the minister, can he explain the processes maybe through which his department engages with the business community to seek out and find out how they can improve their procurement processes and policies? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Mr. Speaker, as I've stated in this House before, we have a number of workshops that we conduct across all regions of the Northwest Territories. I don't have those stats right in front of me, but I know there's a significant amount of people that have attended these. We continue to work with the business community. Certain members in this House have brought up procurement as an issue with me. To date, I still have not got more than probably 5 complaints from the business community. I'm very looking forward to this report that Standing Committee is going to present to me, and I'll gladly sit down and have a discussion with you guys at that time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nundere Cassie, member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and yes, we will be happy to work with the minister and the department when the time comes. Mr. Speaker, it is Small Business Week. It's a great time to champion local and northern businesses. One of the things that's been identified as a challenge in recent weeks and months, in fact, is that a number of our standing offer agreements, in fact, have a number of southern companies that are on the list. And so northern companies find that to be challenging in order to get access. I appreciate that it's a public offering process, but will the minister and will the department give some consideration to, let's say, having southern firms must partner with northern firms in order to get a standing offer agreement with the government of the Northwest Territories? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's a discussion maybe I'm going to have to sit down and have with the chair of the standing committee, because this is something that I haven't found to be an issue. It's a public offering. We have the list, and a number of these people are quite capable, and you know, there's some specific things, specific asks, I believe, in that request of stuff. There's certain entrepreneurs in Northwest Territories that are quite capable of doing these specific things, and it's a tool that the government of Northwest Territories has to be able to address some of the situations we have here. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Kenyon, the member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. My questions are for the Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment, who sets regulations for onshore oil and gas development and aggressively promotes that development. The oil and gas spills and debris liability regulations set absolute liability limits of between $10 and $40 million, depending on the location of a spill or debris. As I said, the Deepwater Horizon disaster resulted in fines and settlements more than 200 times that maximum amount. And I know it's offshore, but onshore it can cost us a lot of money as well. Can the minister explain why there are these liability caps in our regulations and what public purpose they serve? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to try to do the best I can to answer this member's questions because this is a very complicated area within the PRA. So one thing we have to make clear on this is we've mirrored the regulations. That was part of devolution, and that's what we have right now. That's why it's clearly stated out there as laid out. We are working on OGO, I guess we can call it, Oil and Gas Operations Act. That's going forward. We're having a look at it. ORGO is the other side of this issue, which is handled by the Minister of Justice. And from my understanding, ORGO is going out for public consultation, very high level on this act, on what's going on. There's some concerns there for our department as well, and I think some of them are very similar to what the member's going to raise here today. And we will continue to look at it. But this is the reason that these are there right now is because of devolution, and we've mirrored the process. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, the Kidada Cassie, Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I don't think it's actually all that complicated, but the Office of the Regulator of Oil and Gas Operations is currently consulting on managing potential costs for spills and debris associated with oil and gas activities or infrastructure. Can the Minister confirm whether the scope of that review includes changing the oil and gas spills and debris liability regulations or eliminating the liability caps set in those regulations? That's something that Cabinet does. Thanks, Mr. Chair, or Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
No, this is very high-level consultation. They're out there doing this right now. The member will probably have an opportunity to actually go to that and participate in that. I want to advise this House that ITI, like the MLA, we will be invited to make our comments on this consultation, and we're very concerned as well about the liability and the responsibility. That is one of our big concerns around this whole thing. And as well as we want to see more certainty and transparency built into this thing. So we will be commenting it as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tadada Cassie, Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that. So it's very clear the work that ORGO is doing has nothing to do with the caps that are set in Cabinet's regulations. So so earlier today, I recounted the massive costs that can be associated with spills or debris from accidents relating to oil and gas exploration and development. Greenland and Norway have eliminated all liability caps in relation to such accidents. The Auditor General of Canada recommended that such caps for offshore development be reviewed and changed. Would the Minister agree that the liability caps in our regulations place or put our government at some financial risk? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To be clear, these caps are addressed in the regulations, and we're dealing with the Act. That's what we're dealing with. The member's talking like we're opening up the N.W.T to liabilities, and that's not what we're doing. In fact, what we are trying to do is close that loop that exists around suspended wells and clarifying responsibilities that operators in the N.W.T have. These changes that are proposing do not change the fact that in the N.W.T, when they are at fault, the polluter pays. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nundida Cassie, Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thanks to the Minister for that. We are actually talking about the regulations. That's something the Minister has direct control over. He can take this to his Cabinet colleagues and get those regulations changed next week if he wants. So the liability caps in place through the Cabinet-approved regulations are identical to the ones in federal offshore regulations that have not been changed in over 30 years. These caps fly in the face of polluter pays principle, which has been endorsed by our government. Does the Minister agree that the liability caps in our regulations are out of date and should be eliminated immediately? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would agree with the member that they're out of date, but I'm not going to go out and get rid of them immediately. These things are in place. We've mirrored devolution. This is a significant change for our government. If we were to do this, we'd have to go out and engage all stakeholders in the Northwest Territories. And like I've said, we're only looking at the Act right now, not the regulations. But we do have some concerns. I've clearly laid those out and agreed with the member, but I'm not prepared to go out there and just change this on a whim without engaging all stakeholders in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral questions. The member Yellowknife Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment. Mr. Speaker, I fear the Minister is not walking the talk on diversification. Tourism represents a tremendous opportunity for our economy for diversification, but we do need considerable investment to make the most of it. For example, in community infrastructure, he has said that in this biggest ever capital budget, we will see all kinds of goodies, but what I see here is incremental changes rather than new projects. Can he tell me whether there are any new tourism infrastructure projects in the capital budget? Merci.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When ITI is up in the Committee of the Whole, and I believe we're probably going to be one of the first ones up, we have a capital budget of a significant investment of, I can't remember the exact number, but we'll be able to deliberate our capital investment around infrastructure and tourism when I get into the Committee of the Whole around all regions of the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Cassie, member Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I hate to spoil this surprise, but the capital estimates for tourism and parks show a decrease of more than 50% over last year to just over $3 million. So it's hard to reconcile that level of investment with the biggest ever capital budget we've seen. So why is tourism consistently losing out in this government's capital estimates?
Might get cut off.
I'd just like to remind members that capital is before the Committee of the Whole. So when it comes to that, there will be detailed discussion. So it shouldn't be discussed in oral questions, period. So if you want to rephrase your question, member Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my concern is that when it comes to community infrastructure, we are not seeing significant new investments. For example, we heard from my colleague from N.W.T about the lack of tourism services in Tuktoyaktuk, despite years of road development and the anticipation of tourism being a big draw there. Likewise, we don't have a visitor centre here in Yellowknife. So my question is, what kind of investment can we expect before the end of this term in real economic diversification in tourism? Merci.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said, we're going to be going into the Committee of the Whole. We've clearly laid out what our investment is around the money that we've been allocated, and then we will continue to work on that. I'm not scared to talk about tourism. Tourism is a big deal in the Northwest Territories. We just came from the FPT. It's a significant challenge right across this country. Things that I've learned from the earlier this week's meeting at our FPT is some of the challenges right across this whole country is no different than what we're facing in our territory. In fact, when they were doing the presentation, I reached over to the Assistant Deputy Minister and I said it's almost like the exact same thing that's going on in N.W.T and what challenges we're facing. So the whole country is facing these challenges around infrastructure needs, shortage of hotel space, high cost of air across this country. How do we move people out of regional centers to the regions? This is a problem that's right across this country, and it's some very well information shared, I think, across the country that how we got to figure out a way to address this with federal support as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Cassie, member Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker, it's cold comfort to find out that these problems are widespread. We're talking about what's happening here in the N.W.T. and the investments we need now to capitalize on tourism. How many people who went to Tuck and found there wasn't even a place to dump their sewage are going to be in a big hurry to recommend their friends go back? So my question really is about the priority of investing in tourism. I still haven't heard that the minister is willing to invest any additional money in tourism diversification and infrastructure before the end of our term. Is that in fact the case? Mussy.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've said, I only have the money that's allocated to me. But I'm glad to sit down with committee anytime and they want to have a discussion on how we can improve different funding levels for different programs within my portfolio. I'm glad to do that. But the real crux of this is we only have so much money that this government has. And then you're going to have to, if you're going to give it to me, you're going to have to take it from someone else on this side of the room. And so that's the hard discussion that we're going to have to make here. Without increasing revenues in this territory and attracting more capital from industry to help support our economy and grow our economy, because that's 30% of our economy, the non-reserve, the mining sector in particular. What are we going to do? That's why all 19 of us are in this room, and we have to have those discussions. We are trying to grow the economies, particularly the Department of ITI, to unlock our potential and what we're going to do to increase revenues for this government. But the reality is we only have so much money, and if you want to put more money into tourism and diversification, I'm all for it. But we got to have those conversations amongst all of us, and you're going to have to take it from that, my piece of the pie. To make my pie bigger, you're going to have to take it from someone else's. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Non-data Cassie member, Yellowknife Center.
Mr. Speaker, the pie is pretty big at $1.8 billion. I think there are different ways that it can be sliced. And as someone else in this House has already pointed out today, when money is needed on an emergency basis, it's there. So the pie seems to get bigger as needed. So this is a conversation that we will have in the Committee of the Whole on the capital budget and during the O&M budget in the winter. My final question is about the feasibility of winterizing one campground north of Great Slave Lake and one south to accommodate late season travelers. I noted when I went to Hay River about 3 weeks ago that there were quite a number of RVs on the road, and I knew that at the same time they would have nowhere to park on their way to Yellowknife, and there was nowhere to park in Hay River either. The campgrounds are closed. Can the minister consider winterizing 2 campgrounds in the N.W.T. to accommodate these late season travelers? Mussy.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If I remember correctly, we'd have to go to Hansard. I think I made the commitment that when we put out these campgrounds to tender, because it all comes back to funding, that I would actually ask for a provision how much it would cost to keep these things open a little bit longer. Now, based on the amount of money we have allocated, I don't believe that we can do that. One thing we are doing around winter campgrounds is particularly in the Yellowknife region, is we're looking at keeping these accessed for entrepreneurs around the tourism sector to be able to access our campgrounds and use them, and we're doing that. I believe, I can't remember the number off the top of my head at briefing though, but I think there's like 36 businesses that have permits to use our campgrounds for aurora viewing, and we will continue to support that. But the reality is, it comes back to what I just answered in my previous question. There's only so much money, and that's what we got to work with, all of us. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Canada member, Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I guess when you wear rose-colored glasses, red tape just looks like tape. And I think that's sort of the issue we're running into here with this cross-departmental, comprehensive plan to help small businesses. The ministers don't seem to see a problem. I can't believe I'm bringing this up, but I'm going to discuss a few policies here, and the first is procurement. At first, there was no issues. Then he's heard issues from 1 or 2 people. Now it's 5 people he's heard issues from. I've heard issues from 15 people off the top of my head. I get CC'd on the same emails that go to the minister a lot of the time. I see people coming out of this building, and I know what they talk to the minister about. So I know he's got to have heard it more than 5 times. So I'll ask this, because the number keeps growing. How many people have to come to the minister with procurement issues before he considers it to be an actual problem? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Mr. Speaker, I think the member better take his rose-colored glasses off the way he's making comments there. I've had a few people, like I've said, probably five people, I'm going to state of 5 people, come to me about procurement. The chair of standing committee of Sketty is doing a report. I will sit down and have that conversation with Sketty. But I am not going to sit here and get into a debate if it's 1, 10, or 15 people. If the member has 15 people coming to him, maybe he should come to my office. He doesn't stop to my office and talk about procurement issues. He can do that anytime he wants. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, Kirare, Cassie, member, Hay River North.
Maybe the minister should begin reading his emails, Mr. Speaker. Earlier, the member from Yellowknife North brought up standing offer agreements, how the department has standing offer agreements with firms from the south. The minister offered no sort of, the minister stated that northern firms don't have the expertise, and that's why they have to go to the south. What other options has the department looked at? Have they looked at perhaps requiring some northern content when these firms get these agreements, or going to local companies and helping them build that expertise? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Why does it always have to be on the back of the government of Northwest Territories? Can members tell me why does it always have to be on the back of the government? I am a private business person. If I have an issue with a particular type of tender and I don't have the expertise for it, I will reach out to counterparts in Southern Canada to help me. But you guys seem to think it's on the back of the government of the Northwest Territories. The government of Northwest Territories is here to help facilitate and grow the economy and look after the residents of the Northwest Territories. We're not here to get into individual businesses and do the day-to-day transactions that they need to do and grow their businesses. That's on the back of an entrepreneur. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Tada Cassie, member, Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's what ITI does. That's their mandate. That's what the officers do every single day. Well, I'll move to seed now, since I'm talking about all these policies here. Earlier, the member from N.W.T was asking about remedies for business owners who were adversely affected by the disruption of barge resupply, and the minister recommended that they contact ITI about seed. Now, so seed funding is being used to compensate for this failed barge delivery. Where is this seed money coming from, Mr. Speaker? Is it coming from that region's pot of money, or is it coming from the entire territory? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Mr. Speaker, the member's talking about hypotheticals because I said that's where they could go if they had an issue with it. We don't know if there's an issue with it. Each region has their own allocation for seed money, and if there's some kind of overpouring amount of money that we have to have a look at it, I'll certainly have a look at the situation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nundere Cassie, member, Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I haven't seen the situation firsthand, but I take my fellow colleagues at their word. And if the member in N.W.T says there's an issue, then I believe there's an issue. My final question is that, we've had a lot of questions around the table here, and it always comes down to how much money we have. The minister says, I only have this much money in my budget. Well, I think I've sat through one or through supplementary estimate deliberations where the government says we need more money, and then we sit down and we give them more money. Will the minister bring forward a supplementary estimate to improve supports for entrepreneurs? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Speaker, no, I will not.
Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'd like to pursue the issue of the liability caps a little bit further with the Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment. So just to be really clear here, the review that's being carried out by Arogo is about proof of financial responsibility. It's not about the liability caps. Arogo doesn't even set the liability caps. Those are in the regulations. So is the minister clear that the Arogo review has nothing whatsoever to do with the liability caps? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe that's right. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, the Kidade Cassie member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thanks to the Minister for that. We're starting to get on the same page here. So I'd like to ask the Minister, why have the caps not been reviewed in the 4.5 years since devolution? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said, we're moving forward with the mirrored legislation on devolution. We're looking at the Oil and Gas Operations Act. That's what we're working on. We're going to look at the rest of it in the 19th Assembly should this bill pass here. And you know, the member's not going to like this comment, but you know, we have 200 and some mandate commitments within this government of the Northwest Territories. And to zero down on a regulation year where there's exactly no activity going on in our territory wouldn't be a good use of my time and the department's time. But I'm not shunning that responsibility. We are continuing to work on the Act going forward, and regulations will be looked at in the 19th Assembly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tada Cassie member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thanks to the Minister for that. Interesting, a couple of days ago we had the Premier saying that we're going to go and negotiate an entire offshore co-management regime when there's nothing happening with offshore oil and gas. But I think there's a much more likely prospect of onshore development, and we got to make sure that we protect our citizens and our taxpayers and our government from liability. So when will these regulations be reviewed? The Minister could do it next week if he wishes, but when is the Minister going to review these regulations? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
As I said, should this bill to amend the Act pass in this Legislative Assembly, the 19th Assembly will review and modernize the regulations under this Act. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nundere Cassie member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Not very happy with the response from the Minister. These regulations are like less than 4 pages long. In fact, I believe they're actually 1 page long, and the limits are just set here. I don't understand what the difficulty is in reviewing these caps. What sort of process does the Minister envision going through to review a 1-page regulation? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we've sit here and deliberate this conversation around the Oil and Gas Act and the regulations, the members raised a lot of concerns, and I agree with a number of his concerns. This is not something that we're just going to go out and do at a snap of our fingers. We have a lot of different players in this territory. We're committed to deal with all the Aboriginal and Indigenous governments in this territory and the public. I am not just going to change the regulation before we change the legislation on the Act, and I suspect it'll be the way we do our full consultation within the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral questions, Sadze Lahonwonde. Written questions. Written questions, returns to written questions. Returns to written questions. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Petitions. Petitions. Reports of Standing Special Committee. Reports of Standing Special Committee. Reports of Committee on the Review of Bills. Reports on Committee on the Review of Bills. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Pursuant to Section 21 of the Legislative Assembly Retiring Allowances Act, I wish to table the Legislative Assembly Retiring Allowances Fund financial statements for the year ended March 31st, 2018. Notices of motion. Notices of motion. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Motions. Member for Yellowknife Center.
Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Great Slave, that notwithstanding Rule 4, when this House adjourns on October 18th, 2018, it shall be adjourned until Tuesday, October 23rd, 2018, and further, that any time prior to October 23, 2018. If the Speaker is satisfied, after consultation with the Executive Council and members of the Legislative Assembly, that the public interest requires that the House should meet at an earlier time during the adjournment, the Speaker may give notice, and thereupon the House shall meet at the time stated in such notice and shall transact its business as it has been duly adjourned to that time. Merci.
Merci. Motion's in order. To the motion. Question's been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Merci. Motions. Motions. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Consideration Committee of the Whole Bills and Other Matters. Bill 7, Bill 8, Minister's Statement 19-18.3, Table Document 215-18.3, with member for Hay River North in a chair.
I call Committee of the Whole to order. What's the wish of committee? Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, committee would like to consider Bill 8, Emergency Management Act. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. I'll let Minister Schuman catch his breath. We'll take a short recess.
Thank you, Committee. Committee, I will now call the Committee of the Whole back to order. Committee, we have agreed to consider Bill 8. I would now like to ask the Minister responsible for the bill to introduce the bill. Thank you. Minister Moses.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And yes, Mr. Chair, I am here to introduce Bill 8, Emergency Management Act. I would like to thank the Standing Committee on Government Operations for their review of this bill. The purpose of the Emergency Management Act is to repeal and replace the Civil Emergency Measures Act. The Act defines the roles and responsibilities of local authorities and the Government of the Northwest Territories in planning for, responding to, and recovering from emergencies. The proposed amendments permit us to effectively modernize emergency management arrangements for the Northwest Territories, and it establishes a dedicated public body to lead the coordination of activities of the Government of the Northwest Territories regarding emergency management. The bill increases the discretion of community governments to organize and prepare for emergencies. It also clarifies the responsibilities of community governments in meeting the needs of residents during emergencies. Search and rescue volunteers will now receive protection for the important work that they do in helping to keep residents safe in a part of Canada that is both rugged and remote. Much work also has been completed to update the Northwest Territories Emergency Plan, which is an important instrument used to operationalize the Act. Preparations and capacity building have been underway for some time, and the Department is prepared to communicate our new direction to residents, community governments, and emergency management partners. That concludes my opening remarks, and I would be pleased to answer any questions that members may have regarding Bill 8. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Moses. I would now like to ask the Chair of the Standing Committee on Government Operations, which reviewed this bill, to make comments. Mr. Tester.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Standing Committee on Government Operations is pleased to have reviewed Bill 8 Emergency Management Act. We consulted broadly with all governments in the Northwest Territories responsible for providing municipal services in the Northwest Territories, and we held public meetings in Hay River, Enterprise, and Yellowknife, in addition to meeting with the Mayor and Council members in Inuvik. Several issues were raised during our public consultations. The Act changes the existing process so that ministerial approval is required to renew a state of local emergency. We heard general acceptance for this proposal, which ensures that the Minister is aware and can bring territorial resources to bear on continuing emergency situations in municipalities. Another key proposal in Bill 8 is to extend indemnity to local authorities and volunteers working on their behalf, so they are not liable for damage caused by any actions taken in good faith during an emergency response. The committee agrees with this proposal and heard no objections from municipalities to it. The committee also heard a concern that Section 18, brackets 2 of the bill authorizes the head of a local authority to act on behalf of the local authority where there is urgency in declaring a state of local emergency. But the Act does not define the head of a local authority. The committee determined that it would be important in the implementation of Bill 8 to make the meaning of the provision clear to municipalities. Therefore, the committee encourages the Minister, when implementing the new legislation, to ensure that municipalities are aware, if they do not already know, that Section 18, brackets 2 of the bill refers to the Mayor or anyone acting on behalf of the Mayor rather than the senior administrative officer. Finally, Bill 8 clarifies an existing provision in the Civil Emergencies Measures Act by setting out the circumstances under which the Minister might require a municipality to reimburse the N.W.T for expenses paid out on behalf of the municipality during an emergency. We heard some concern that Section 13, brackets 2 of the bill provides that the Minister's decision on the matter is final. The committee had some discussion of this provision, and on the basis of the rarity of its past use and the clarifying circumstances under which repayment might be required, the committee is satisfied with this provision as written. Therefore, on the basis of our consultation, committee recommended no changes to Bill 8 as drafted. individual members may have additional comments or questions as we proceed with consideration of this bill. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testard. I would now like to ask the Minister responsible for Bill 8 if he would like to bring witnesses into the House.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and yes, I do.
Thank you, Minister Moses. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. I will now ask the Sergeant of Arms to escort witnesses into the chamber. Would the Minister please introduce the witnesses?
Yes, Mr. Chair. On my left, I have Mr. Kevin Brzezinski, Director of Public Safety with the Department of MACA. And on my right, Mr. Ian Reddy, Legislative Counsel with the Department of Justice. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Moses. I will now open the floor to general comments on Bill 8, Emergency Management Act. Detail. Is the committee agreed that there are no further comments? Agreed. Can we proceed to a clause-by-clause review of Bill 8? Thank you. Does committee also agree that we consider the clauses in groups? Thank you. Committee, we will defer the bill number and title until after consideration of the clauses. There are 35 clauses in the bill. Let's turn to page 1. Clauses 1 to 5. Agreed. Thank you. Clauses 6 to 10. Clauses 11 to 15. Clauses 16 to 20. Clauses 21 to 25. Clauses 26 to 30. Clauses 31 to 35. Thank you. We will now return to the bill number and title. Bill 8, Emergency Management Act. Does committee agree? Thank you. Bill as a whole. Does the committee agree that Bill 8 is ready for third reading? Bill 8, Emergency Management Act, is now ready for third reading. Thank you to the Minister and his witnesses. Sergeant of Arms, please escort the witnesses from the chamber. What is the wish of committee? Mr. Bolin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move that the chair rise and report progress. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
A motion is on the floor to report progress. The motion is in order and is non-debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. I will now rise and report progress. Thank you.
The report, Member Mackenzie Delta.
Mr. Speaker, your committee has been considering Bill 7, Chartered Professionals Act, Accountants Act, Bill 8, Emergency Management Act, Member Statement 19-18(3), Aurora College Foundational Review Process, Table Document 215-18(3), Capital Estimates 2019-2020, Member Statement 103-18(3), Marine Transportation Services, and would like to report progress. That Bill 8, Emergency Management Act, is ready for third reading. And Mr. Speaker, I would move that the report of the Committee of the Whole be concluded. Thank you.
Do I have a seconder? Member for Hay River South. Motion's in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Must Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Mr. Clerk, orders of the day.
Orders of the day for Tuesday, October 23rd, 2018, 1:30 p.m. Prayer, minister statements, member statements, reports of standing and special committees, returns to oral questions, recognition of visitors in the gallery, acknowledgments, oral questions, returns to written questions, replies to commissioner's opening address, petitions, reports of committees on the review of bills, tabling of documents, notices of motion for first reading of bills, motions, first reading of bills, second reading of bills, consideration in committee of the whole of bills and other matters. Bill 7, Minister Statement 19-18(3), Minister Statement 103-18(3), Table Document 215-18(3), Report of Committee of the Whole, third reading of bills, orders of the day.
Mr. Clerk, this House stands adjourned until Tuesday, October 23rd, 1:30 p.m.